As you've read, operant conditioning is a type of learning in which voluntary behavior is strengthened. This happens when the correct behavior is shaped by reinforcement or incorrect behavior is diminished through the use of punishment. In this lesson, we'll explore the concepts of reinforcement and motivation in conditioned learning. As you learned in your assigned reading, psychologist B.F. Skinner modified his subject's behavior through the use of positive reinforcement, which is reinforcement of a desired behavior through the addition of a pleasurable stimulus. Keep in mind that the use of the word positive does not refer to good actions or good behaviors. The word positive simply refers to the addition of a pleasurable stimulus. This means that positive reinforcement could be used to strengthen a behavior that might not be desirable. So, if positive reinforcement is the addition of a pleasurable stimulus, then it's easy to realize that negative reinforcement is the attempt to shape behavior through the removal of or reduction of an unpleasant stimulus. Think about it this way. Let's say I coach track, and I want all of my athletes to be able to run a 4-minute mile. Well, that's an incredibly ambitious goal. So I could use positive reinforcement, or I could make them all run with a rock in one shoe and only allow them to remove that rock when they've run a 4-minute mile 5 consecutive times. In this example, I'm shaping the desired behavior, running a 4-minute mile, by promising the removal of an unpleasant stimulus, the rock in the shoe, once my desired behavior is met. This is negative reinforcement. The use of reinforcers is different from punishment. As noted in your assigned readings, the effect of punishment is in fact the opposite of that of reinforcement. With punishment, you're trying to decrease a behavior, to make the behavior less likely to happen again. This table breaks down the differences between reinforcement and punishment. Remember, reinforcers seek to encourage a specific behavior, while punishment seeks to diminish a specific behavior. That said, just like you have positive and negative reinforcement, you also have positive and negative punishment. As you can see, whereas positive reinforcement is the addition of a pleasant stimulus to encourage behavior, positive punishment is the addition of an unpleasant stimulus to discourage behavior. Note that the definitions of negative reinforcement and negative punishment are also opposites. In the early 20th century, as researchers in behaviorism doubled down on Thorndike's law of effect, that rewarded behavior is likely to recur, they continued to explore the role of reinforcement in encouraging desired behavior. To their surprise, they discovered that their animal subjects, and by extension human subjects, do not always exhibit their learning as expected. Take, for instance, the work of Edward Tolman. In the 1930s, Tolman conducted a series of experiments to test learning in rats using a maze. The rats were placed in 3 different groups. In the first group, the rats were reinforced with food when they made it out the other side of the maze, a typical positively reinforced group. In the second group, the rats were not immediately positively reinforced for their learning until the 10th day of the experiment, when they began to receive reinforcement. The third group was the control group. They received no reinforcement for the duration of the experiment. Tolman was a strict behaviorist. He predicted that the rats of the first group would learn the maze successfully very quickly, given their positive reinforcement, while the rats in the other groups would struggle to learn the maze without reinforcement. He assumed that the rats of the second group wouldn't start to learn the maze until the 10th day, when their learning was going to be positively reinforced. And he predicted it would then take the rats in Group 2 as long to learn the maze as it had taken the rats in Group 1. However, those weren't the results he got. The rats of the second group began to solve the maze consistently after receiving reinforcement only once on the 10th day of the experiment. Well, how to explain this? Tolman concluded that, despite receiving no reinforcement prior to the 10th day, the rats of Group 2 had nonetheless learned the maze during the first 9 days of the experiment. He said that they had formed a cognitive map of the physical layout of the maze. This learning had been stored away but not demonstrated because there was no reason, no motivation, for these rats to demonstrate their learning. Tolman postulated that this cognitive map had then remained hidden, that it was latent, until the rats had a reason to demonstrate their learning through reinforcement. Tolman called this kind of learning latent learning. the concept that learning could happen without reinforcement, and that this learning could later affect behavior once there was reinforcement. Tolman had stumbled upon a puzzle that behaviorists could not immediately explain because at the time, in the early 20th century, behaviorists did not study the cognitive elements of learning because cognition could not be objectively measured. Psychologist Wolfgang Kohler explored another aspect of cognitive elements in learning in 1925. Kohler was stranded on the Canary Islands when World War I broke out, so he focused on working in the primate research lab there. Curious about how primates exhibit learning, Kohler set up a problem in which one of the chimpanzees, Sultan, had to get a bunch of bananas that was placed up high. Sultan quickly realized that he could stretch up to grab the bananas, at first. Kohler kept making the problem of acquiring the bananas more and more difficult by placing them higher and higher. Kohler left objects, possible tools, inside the pen that Sultan could potentially use to get the bananas. Well, Sultan stood atop one crate but grew frustrated when he still couldn't reach the bananas. And then, all of a sudden, Sultan began stacking the crates to create a tower. Then he climbed the crates and grabbed the bananas. Kohler referred to this type of learning as insight learning, a type of spontaneous coming together of all previous knowledge, and he determined that it could not be gained through trial and error alone. Moreover, once he'd learned how to get to the bananas, Sultan exhibited this learning over and over again, and he seems to have taught it to the other apes as well. At the time, this was yet another cognitive puzzle that behaviorists could not explain. In the late 1960s, psychologist Martin Seligman was attempting to study escape and avoidance learning using classical conditioning in dogs. Seligman presented a tone followed by a harmless but painful electric shock to one group of dogs. These dogs were harnessed, so they could not escape the shock. Researchers assumed that the dogs would learn to fear the sound of the tone and that they would try to escape before being shocked. In other words, they were testing how quickly the dogs developed the expectancy of the shock and what they would do to try to avoid it. Later, this original group of conditioned dogs was compared to another control group that hadn't been taught to fear the tone. Each group was placed in a special box with a low fence that divided the box into two compartments. The dogs were placed in one compartment and were all unharnessed. Seligman predicted that the group of conditioned dogs would hear the tone, realize that a shock was coming, and they would jump the low fence to avoid the shock. Certainly, this is what the control group of dogs did. They'd never been exposed to the tone, so they heard it, appeared startled, and all jumped the fence. The group of conditioned dogs, however, did not attempt to escape the shock. Upon hearing the tone, they just sat there. Despite the fact that this group of dogs showed distress at the shock, they didn't even try to jump the fence. Why hadn't they? Researchers concluded that, in their previous conditioning, the dogs had learned that they simply could not escape the shock. Time after time, the tone had sounded and they were shocked. They'd apparently come to believe that they could not escape the situation, and so they didn't even try to escape it, even when their environment had changed. Seligman called this result, the inability or unwillingness to act, learned helplessness, the tendency to fail to act or escape from a situation because of a history of repeated failures. By the 1960s, behaviorists were considering the role that cognition might play in behavior, and so behaviorists like Seligman began to think about how some previously unexplained behaviors, such as latent or insight learning, might reflect cognitive processes. Seligman eventually came to believe that learned helplessness could explain a diagnosis of depression in some people. In more recent times, advocates for abuse victims point to learned helplessness as the reason why some people remain in abusive relationships. So the dogs in Seligman's experiment, the ones who had learned helplessness, didn't have the motivation to change their situation. So obviously, motivation plays an enormous role in learning. In conditioned learning, reinforcers and punishment act as extrinsic motivation, the desire to exhibit certain behaviors because of the promise of external rewards or the avoidance of punishment. But intrinsic motivation, the desire to exhibit a behavior for its own sake, exists as well. Learning by observation, the most common type of learning for humans, is often most successful when the learner is intrinsically motivated to learn. However, it is possible to over-reinforce behaviors. When exploring the cognitive aspects of operant conditioning, researchers found that continuous reinforcement can backfire. Basically, it seems like individuals come to believe that if you have to be rewarded constantly for doing something, then doing it must not be worthwhile in and of itself. This over-justification effect was seen even when the subject, often children, were initially intrinsically motivated to complete a task. For instance, even when children liked coloring, they were less likely to color, or to color well, after they were rewarded for coloring on a very consistent basis. However, the lessons learned through behaviorism have led to multiple therapies and strategies that have helped people modify their behavior. This is called applied behavior analysis, or ABA. It is a type of behavior modification that uses shaping, operant conditioning, to mold a desired behavior or response. It is primarily used with children and adults on the autism spectrum. In ABA, skills are broken down to their simplest steps and then taught to the subject through a system of reinforcement. As the subject masters the skill or behavior, the reinforcement is gradually withdrawn until the skill is performed independently. Psychologists today believe that learning, whether conditioned or not, is influenced by an individual's cognitive processes. Our next unit on cognitive psychology explores these connections in greater depth.